The elevator climbed 43 floors in perfect silence, carrying him toward another day of measured invisibility. Outside the glass walls of the tower, Manhattan stretched endlessly, a concrete maze where millions moved with purpose he had never been allowed to claim as his own. Daniel adjusted his tie, the same navy one he had worn for 3 years, purchased with his first paycheck from a discount store his mother would never know about. The reflection in the polished steel doors showed a young man who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. 28 years old, carrying the weight of dreams deferred and the quiet dignity his mother had stitched into every lesson she taught him while cleaning these very floors. The 44th floor smelled of leather and ambition. Executive assistants moved with choreographed efficiency, their heels clicking against marble that his mother had polished countless times during her overnight shifts. He walked past offices where decisions worth millions were made by men who had never wondered if they deserved to be there. His desk sat in the corner of the operations floor, strategically positioned where natural light barely reached. A computer from 2019, a phone that rang with administrative requests, and a stack of reports that existed solely to justify his salary. Around him, the real work happened. Strategy meetings he was never invited to. Client calls that shaped the future of educational technology for millions of students he would never meet. Daniel opened his laptop and began his daily ritual of optimization. Small efficiencies that saved the company thousands, but earned him no recognition. Process improvements that streamlined operations while keeping him firmly planted in his designated corner. He had learned to find satisfaction in work that mattered, even when the work was designed to keep him from mattering. Through the glass partition, he could see the conference room where the senior team gathered each morning. Today, something was different. Urgent gestures, furrowed brows, the kind of energy that preceded either breakthrough or catastrophe. He had watched these patterns for 3 years, learning to read the corporate weather without ever being invited to comment on the forecast. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "Working late again tonight? Left dinner in the fridge. Don't forget to eat." She had been cleaning this building for 15 years, started when he was 13, desperate for any work that could support them after his father disappeared into the kind of silence that leaves no forwarding address. Every night, she moved through these floors like a ghost, ensuring that powerful men could start their days in pristine environments they would never think to appreciate. The irony was not lost on him. His mother maintained the foundation while he organized the footnotes. Both invisible, both essential, both trapped in a system that needed them to remain exactly where they were. Daniel closed the text and returned to his spreadsheet. Column after column of data that would inform decisions he would never make. Numbers that represented real students, real communities, real opportunities that someone else would define and distribute according to logic he was not consulted to understand. But numbers told stories for those who knew how to listen, and Daniel had learned to hear what others missed. The presentation had taken him 3 weeks to prepare. Every slide polished, every statistic verified, every projection built on data he had gathered during lunch breaks and stolen moments between administrative tasks. The educational platform concept was more than ambitious. It was revolutionary. A system that could bring university-level courses to underserved communities, using adaptive technology to meet students where they actually lived and learned. He had requested the meeting through proper channels, following protocols that seemed designed to discourage rather than facilitate. 2 weeks of forms, supervisor approvals, and scheduling complications that finally culminated in this moment. 15 minutes before the executive committee, standing at the head of a mahogany table that cost more than his annual salary. The conference room occupied the building's southwest corner, floor-to-ceiling windows framing Central Park like an expensive painting. 12 executives sat in leather chairs that whispered wealth with every movement. At the far end, CEO Marcus Donovan thumbed through quarterly reports with the distracted attention of a man accustomed to filtering information through layers of predetermined conclusions. Daniel's voice remained steady as he outlined the market opportunity. 3 million adults in the tri-state area without college degrees, 40% of them concentrated in zip codes where traditional universities had never established meaningful presence. His platform could bridge that gap, delivering customized curricula through partnerships with public libraries, community centers, and mobile access points. The numbers were compelling. The technology was feasible. The social impact was undeniable. The silence that followed stretched long enough for doubt to creep through his carefully constructed confidence. He watched faces that revealed nothing, waiting for engagement that never materialized. Someone checked their phone. Another executive whispered something to his neighbor that prompted a barely concealed smirk. Marcus Donovan finally looked up from his documents, his gaze settling on Daniel with the weight of final judgment. The CEO's expression was neither hostile nor particularly interested. It carried the efficient indifference of a man dismissing a minor inconvenience. "Your place is in the Rewrote." The words hit like a physical blow, though Daniel's expression never changed. Rewrote, footnote. A dismissal so complete it didn't even require English, as if his entire proposal, his weeks of work, his vision for transforming educational access deserved nothing more than a foreign word that most people in the room probably didn't understand, but whose meaning was perfectly clear. "Security considerations alone make this impossible," Donovan continued, closing the folder. "Our corporate partnerships require certain discretions. This kind of initiative could complicate relationships we've spent years building." The meeting ended without discussion. Executives filed out with the efficient movement of people whose time was too valuable for explanations. Daniel gathered his materials, muscle memory carrying him through motions, while his mind struggled to process what had just occurred. In the hallway, he passed his reflection in a glass partition and stopped. The young man staring back at him looked exactly the same as 15 minutes earlier, but something fundamental had shifted. Not defeat. That would imply he had ever expected victory. This was clarification. A moment when pretense fell away and reality presented itself without decoration. His phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, performance review, 3:30 p.m. The timing was not coincidental. The performance review lasted exactly 12 minutes. Daniel sat across from his supervisor, Patricia Henley, watching her navigate through predetermined talking points with practiced efficiency. Adequate performance. Room for improvement in strategic thinking. Need to better align personal initiatives with company priorities. The reduction in responsibilities was presented as professional guidance, no more direct client contact, limited access to strategic planning meetings. Administrative tasks would now comprise 80% of his role, ensuring he could focus on areas where his skill set was most appropriately utilized. Patricia's voice carried the hollow sympathy of someone delivering a script. "We believe this adjustment will help you find your proper place within our organizational structure." There was that word again. Place. As if geography was destiny, as if some cosmic algorithm had calculated his coordinates and found them fundamentally incompatible with significance. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ascent. Each floor that passed marked another layer of distance from the altitude where decisions were made. By the time he reached the lobby, Daniel understood that he had just witnessed his professional funeral, conducted with the efficient politeness that corporate culture used to mask its cruelest transactions. The evening shift was beginning. Security guards nodded as cleaning crews moved through turnstiles, invisible armies preparing to maintain the illusion that success cleaned itself. Daniel waited in the lobby until he saw her, Maria Oliveira, his mother, pushing a cart loaded with supplies toward the service elevator. She looked older than her 53 years, wearing the uniform that had become her second skin. But her posture remained straight, her movements deliberate, carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had never confused her worth with other people's recognition of it. "You're early tonight," she said in Portuguese, her voice carrying the warmth that had sustained him through every disappointment. "They finished with me early today." She studied his face with the precision of a mother who had learned to read her son's silences. "Bad day? Clarifying day." They rode the service elevator together, an intimacy the building's architects had never intended. Maria shared gossip from the cleaning crew, stories about executives who worked late because they couldn't bear to go home, about million-dollar deals discussed over pizza boxes left on conference room tables. "You know what I learned cleaning these offices for 15 years?" she asked as they reached the 44th floor. "The higher you go, the more people forget that the building has a foundation." Daniel watched her begin her nightly routine, wiping down surfaces that would be dirty again by morning, emptying trash cans filled with discarded ambitions and failed strategies. Her movements were methodical, almost meditative, each task performed with care that had nothing to do with recognition. In the conference room where his presentation had died, she cleaned around the mahogany table with particular attention. Daniel noticed she spent extra time on the chair where Marcus Donovan had delivered his verdict, polishing the leather with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. "This is where they told you your place was in the footnote," she said, without looking up. Daniel stared at her. "How did you?" "These walls are thin. Sound carries through vents. I've heard a lot of conversations over the years." She continued polishing, her voice steady. "I also know they're wrong." The simple certainty in her voice carried weight that no corporate hierarchy could diminish. Maria Oliveira had cleaned countless meetings, witnessed thousands of decisions, observed the machinery of power from angles its operators never considered. Her perspective was not naive. It was comprehensive. "The Rewrote isn't where you belong," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "It's where you start. Footnotes are where people hide the most important information." Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered with ambition and achievement, a constellation of dreams realized and deferred. Daniel stood beside his mother in the silence of power temporarily abandoned, understanding that his education was not ending, but beginning to transform into something no business school had ever taught. The Bronx Public Library on East 165th Street smelled of old paper and quiet determination. Daniel had been coming here for 3 weeks, using the public computers during his lunch breaks to research educational technology patents and community development models. The corporate building felt suffocating since his demotion, but here, surrounded by people who treated knowledge as a public resource rather than private property, he could breathe. The children's section buzzed with controlled chaos. A story hour was ending, and kids scattered toward different corners of the library like seeds finding soil. Near the computer terminals, a woman in her early 30s struggled with an outdated desktop, her fingers hesitant on keys that seemed to mock her efforts. Carmen Rodriguez had the focused concentration of someone for whom every minute mattered. 2 children sat at her feet, twins, maybe 7 years old, sharing a picture book while she navigated a job application website that kept crashing. Her resume was open in another window, a document that told the story of interrupted education and survival-based career choices: retail associate, home health aide, part-time receptionist. Daniel watched her restart the computer for the 3rd time, her frustration carefully contained so the children wouldn't worry. The boy twin looked up from the picture book, his dark eyes scanning the room until they landed on Daniel. Instead of looking away, the child held his gaze with curious directness. "Mummy's trying to get a better job," the boy announced to Daniel, as if they had been in conversation for hours. "Miguel, don't bother the man," Carmen said, without looking up from the screen. "He's not bothered," the girl twin said, Sophia studying Daniel with the same unflinching attention as her brother. "Are you bothered?" Daniel found himself walking over before he had consciously decided to move. "What kind of job are you looking for?" Carmen glanced up, her expression guarded but not unfriendly. Administrative assistant, stable hours, benefits, something that doesn't require me to choose between work and being present for them. The application website had frozen again. Daniel could see the problem immediately. The library's outdated browser couldn't handle the site's modern coding. A fixable issue if you knew the workaround. "May I?" He gestured toward the computer. Carmen hesitated, then moved aside. Daniel opened a new browser window, adjusted some settings, and refreshed the page. The application loaded smoothly. "How did you—" Carmen started. "I work with computers," Daniel said, though that barely described his relationship with technology. "Mind if I show you a few tricks?" For the next 20 minutes, he walked Carmen through navigation shortcuts, showed her how to save her work in multiple formats, explained why certain fields were flagged as errors. The twins watched this interaction with intense focus, as if witnessing a magic show. "You're smart," Sophia declared when Daniel finished. "You're patient," Miguel added. Their mother's cheeks flushed slightly. "They don't usually talk to strangers. I'm sorry if they're being inappropriate." "They're being honest," Daniel said. "That's different." Carmen successfully submitted her application, then turned to face him fully for the first time. Her expression carried the wariness of someone who had learned to question generosity, but also the exhaustion of someone who couldn't afford to reject help. "Are you a teacher?" she asked. "No. I work in corporate education technology. Or I used to." The admission surprised him with its honesty. "Used to." Daniel looked at the twins, who were now organizing their shared picture book with collaborative precision. "I'm figuring out what I actually do." Something in his voice must have resonated, because Carmen's guardedness softened slightly. "I understand that feeling." The library's closing announcement echoed through the building. Carmen began gathering the children's things with practiced efficiency, but Miguel tugged on Daniel's sleeve before they could leave. "Will you be here tomorrow?" the boy asked. Daniel found himself nodding before considering the implications. "Probably." "Good," Sophia said with finality. "Mommy might need more computer help." As they walked toward the exit, Carmen turned back. "Thank you. For the help, and for talking to them like they matter." They do matter. The simple exchange lingered with Daniel as he rode the subway back to Manhattan, watching the city change from neighborhood to neighborhood, community to commodity. For the first time in weeks, the weight of corporate dismissal felt less like a sentence and more like an invitation to find where he actually belonged. 3 days later, Daniel arrived at the library with a small notebook and a borrowed laptop from his building's lost and found, a forgotten device no one had claimed in months. Carmen was there again, this time working on a different application, while the twins built elaborate structures with picture books at a nearby table. "Computer man!" Miguel called out when he spotted Daniel, his face breaking into an unreserved grin. Sophia looked up from her book tower. "Did you bring more computer magic?" Carmen smiled apologetically. "They've been asking about you since Tuesday. I think you made an impression." Daniel set up at a computer terminal near theirs, ostensibly to work on his own research, but really to be available if needed. He was deep in reading about community education models when he felt a small presence beside his chair. Sophia stood there holding a worn picture book, studying his screen with serious concentration. "What are you reading?" she asked. "Research about how to help people learn things when they can't go to regular schools." "Like us?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" Sophia opened her picture book to a page showing children in a classroom. "Miguel and me, we learn different. Teachers get frustrated because we ask too many questions, or we get bored when they go slow. Mommy says we're smart, but difficult." Miguel appeared on Daniel's other side, apparently having abandoned his book construction project. "We're not difficult. Other people just don't understand how our brains work." Daniel saved his document and turned to face both children fully. "Tell me about how your brains work." What followed was an impromptu conversation that revealed more about learning theory than any graduate seminar Daniel had attended. The twins explained how they preferred to learn through patterns and connections rather than linear sequences, how they understood concepts better when they could move while thinking, how traditional classroom structures felt like trying to pour water into containers that were the wrong shape. Carmen had stopped her job searching to listen, her expression cycling between pride and concern. They tested above grade level in everything, but the school says they're not a good fit for the gifted program, too disruptive to classroom dynamics. "We're not disruptive," Miguel protested. "We just think out loud." Daniel understood immediately. These children were like the students his rejected platform had been designed to serve, learners whose intelligence didn't conform to institutional expectations. But instead of being overlooked by the system, they were being actively penalized for thinking differently. "Can I show you something?" Daniel opened his notebook and sketched a simple diagram of adaptive learning pathways. What if education could adjust to how each person learns, instead of forcing everyone to learn the same way? The twins leaned in, following his drawing with the intense focus they had shown since their first meeting. Sophia traced one of the pathways with her finger, like choose-your-own-adventure books, but for math and science. Exactly like that. For the next hour, Daniel found himself in the most engaging educational discussion of his career. The twins asked questions that cut straight to the heart of pedagogical challenges he had spent months researching. Carmen contributed insights about the practical barriers that kept families like hers from accessing quality education, transportation, scheduling, childcare, technology gaps. "The problem isn't that kids like Miguel and Sophia can't learn," Carmen said as they prepared to leave. "It's that the system only knows one way to teach." Daniel watched them gather their things, noting how the twins helped each other automatically, how Carmen managed multiple tasks while keeping track of both children's needs, how they functioned as a unit despite the obvious pressure they were under. "Carmen," he said as they reached the library entrance, "what if I told you someone was working on exactly the kind of learning platform we were talking about?" She paused, studying his face carefully. "I'd ask why you're telling me. Because I think you and the twins might be able to help make it better." Miguel tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Can we help with the computer magic?" Carmen looked between Daniel and her children, weighing possibilities against the learned caution of someone who had been disappointed before. "What exactly are you asking?" "To be part of something that might actually work." The invitation hung in the air between them, carrying weight that none of them fully understood yet. But Daniel could see something shifting in Carmen's expression. Not trust, exactly, but curiosity about what collaboration might look like when it served families instead of institutions. "We'll think about it," she said finally. As Daniel rode the subway back to Manhattan, he realized he had just made his first real decision since the presentation disaster. Not a reaction to corporate rejection, but a choice towards something that felt authentic. The twins' voices echoed in his mind, asking questions no boardroom had ever considered. What if learning could be an adventure? What if intelligence came in patterns no test had been designed to measure? For the first time in months, Daniel felt like he was moving toward something rather than away from it. The following Tuesday, Carmen arrived at the library with a manila folder tucked under her arm. The twins ran ahead to the computer section, calling out Daniel's name before they could even see him. When they spotted him at his usual terminal, Miguel immediately climbed onto the chair beside him, while Sophia peered over his shoulder at the screen. "Look what Mommy brought," Sophia announced as Carmen approached with visible uncertainty. Carmen placed the folder on the table, her movements careful and deliberate. "I've been thinking about what you said." "About helping." She opened the folder to reveal handwritten notes, printed articles, and sketches. "I may not have a college degree, but I've been researching how my kids learn for 7 years. The folder contained a detailed analysis that would have impressed any educational researcher. Carmen had documented learning patterns, tracked which teaching methods worked with which subjects, identified optimal times of day for different types of cognitive tasks. Her observations were precise, methodical, and deeply intuitive. "This is incredible," Daniel said, genuinely amazed. "Have you shown this to their teachers?" Carmen's expression tightened slightly. "I tried. They said it was nice that I was involved, but that I should trust the professionals to handle educational decisions. They didn't even read it," Miguel added with matter-of-fact indignation. Daniel studied the notes more carefully. Carmen had essentially reverse-engineered personalized learning theory through direct observation of her children. Her insights about cognitive flexibility, attention cycling, and motivation triggers were more sophisticated than anything he had encountered in corporate educational research. "Carmen, this isn't just helpful, it's groundbreaking. You've identified patterns that most educational theorists miss because they're studying learning in artificial environments." "You really think so?" The question carried years of dismissed expertise. "I know so." Daniel opened his laptop and showed her the platform prototype he had been developing in secret. "Everything you've documented here aligns perfectly with adaptive learning algorithms. The difference is you understand the human element that technology alone can't capture." For the next 2 hours, they worked together to map Carmen's observations onto Daniel's technical framework. The twins contributed by testing different interface designs, immediately identifying which features felt intuitive versus which created confusion. Their feedback was precise and unfiltered, exactly what the platform needed. Sophia pointed to a navigation menu on the screen. "This is confusing. Why do I have to click 3 times to get to the fun part?" Miguel nodded in agreement. "The best games don't make you work to find the game." Daniel realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, not just user testing, but collaborative design with the people who would actually benefit from the platform. Carmen's research provided the pedagogical foundation, while the twins offered real-time usability insights that no corporate focus group could replicate. "What if we could pilot this?" Daniel asked, though he was thinking out loud more than making a proposal. Carmen looked up from her notes. "What do you mean?" "Start small, maybe with a few families here at the library. Use your research as the foundation for personalized learning paths. See if this actually works in practice. Would that be allowed?" Carmen's question carried the wariness of someone who had learned to expect barriers. "I don't know," Daniel admitted, "but I think we should find out." The twins exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. "Can we help build it?" Sophia asked. "Not just help," Daniel said. "Lead it. This platform only works if it's designed by and for people like you." Carmen closed her folder slowly, her expression cycling through doubt, hope, and something approaching determination. "I need to think about this, not just for me, but for them. If we start something and it doesn't work, it will disappoint them," Daniel finished. "I understand." "No," Carmen said quietly. "It will teach them that their ideas don't matter." Again! The weight of that possibility settled over their conversation. Daniel understood that Carmen wasn't just protecting her children from failure, she was protecting them from a world that had already taught them to expect dismissal. "What if we started even smaller?" he suggested. "Just document what we're learning here. No commitments, no pressure. Just see what happens when kids get to help design their own education." Miguel bounced slightly in his chair. "Like being education scientists?" "Exactly like that." Carmen studied her children's faces, reading excitement and hope that she was clearly reluctant to encourage but couldn't bring herself to discourage. "1 week," she said finally. "We try it for 1 week and see what happens." Daniel nodded, understanding that this tentative agreement represented an enormous act of trust. Carmen was allowing him into her family's vulnerability, betting her children's emotional safety on his ability to follow through on promises that corporate America had taught him to doubt. As they packed up to leave, Sophia tugged on Daniel's sleeve. Are you going to keep your promise? Which promise? To make learning feel like an adventure. Daniel looked down at her serious face, then at Miguel's expectant expression, then at Carmen's carefully guarded hope. Yes, he said. That's exactly the promise I'm going to keep. Walking home that evening, Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settling around him like a new skin. For the first time since his corporate humiliation, he was accountable to something that mattered more than his own wounded pride. 2 7-year-olds were counting on him to prove that their intelligence was valuable, that their mother's insights were valid, that families like theirs deserved educational tools designed with their success in mind. The pressure was enormous. It was also exactly what he needed. The platform's first week exceeded every expectation Daniel had dared to hold. Working with Carmen and the twins after library hours, they had created learning modules that adapted in real time to individual cognitive patterns. Miguel gravitated toward kinesthetic problem-solving, while Sophia preferred visual spatial challenges that let her think in 3 dimensions. Both children completed complex educational tasks with engagement levels Daniel had never witnessed in traditional classroom settings. But success bred complications. Word spread organically through the library's community networks. Other families began asking questions. Carmen fielded requests from parents whose children also struggled with standardized learning approaches. The librarians started mentioning the informal program to visitors. What had begun as a quiet experiment was developing its own momentum. Daniel found himself caught between exhilaration and anxiety. Each new family that expressed interest represented validation of everything he had tried to communicate in that failed corporate presentation. But each expansion also moved him further from the safety of obscurity and closer to the kind of visibility that could attract unwanted attention. The internal conflict intensified when he discovered something during his mother's midnight cleaning rounds. While helping her empty trash cans in the executive conference rooms, Daniel noticed discarded documents that revealed his former employer was facing a retention crisis. User engagement on their educational platforms had dropped 30% over 6 months. Premium subscriptions were being cancelled at rates that threatened quarterly projections. The papers contained detailed analysis of competitor platforms, market research about community-based learning initiatives, and strategic memos discussing the need for innovative approaches to underserved demographics. Everything his rejected presentation had proposed was now being considered as a potential solution to their declining market position. Standing in that same conference room, where Marcus Donovan had dismissed him to the footnotes, Daniel felt a surge of vindication, so intense it bordered on rage. They had rejected his vision when it came from him, but now they were desperately seeking exactly what he had offered. The irony was perfect, and the temptation for revenge was overwhelming. Daniel could have walked into any competitor's office with inside information about his former employer's vulnerabilities. He could have used his growing platform to publicly expose their failure to innovate. He could have positioned himself as the visionary they had foolishly dismissed, riding their crisis toward his own corporate redemption. Instead, he found himself thinking about Miguel's question from the previous day. Why do some people get to decide what's smart and other people don't? The boy had asked this while working through a mathematics module that adjusted to his learning pace, demonstrating mastery that no standardized test would recognize because it didn't conform to predetermined timelines. Daniel realized that his choice wasn't between success and failure, but between 2 fundamentally different definitions of victory. Corporate vindication would require playing by the same rules that had excluded families like Carmen's in the first place. Building something authentic meant accepting that the most important victories might never be acknowledged by the systems that had rejected him. The moral clarity was uncomfortable. Daniel had spent years believing that his goal was to prove himself worthy of institutional recognition. Now he was discovering that the institution itself might be the problem, that winning their approval could mean abandoning the people who had shown him what education could actually accomplish. Carmen sensed his internal struggle during their next meeting. She watched him work with unusual distraction, noticed how he checked his phone more frequently, observed the tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there during their first collaborative sessions. "Everything okay?" she asked, as the twins worked independently on their learning modules. "Just thinking about scaling challenges," Daniel said, which was technically true but emotionally incomplete. Carmen studied his face with the perception of someone who had learned to read unspoken concerns. Scaling challenges or identity challenges? The question was more insightful than Daniel was prepared to handle. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's one thing to help a few families in a library. It's another thing to build something that might threaten powerful people who already dismissed you once." Daniel looked at her with new respect. Carmen understood the stakes in ways that extended far beyond educational theory. She recognized that their small experiment was developing implications that could draw attention from forces neither of them was equipped to handle alone. "Are you worried?" he asked. "Worried about you?" Carmen said quietly. "Not worried about this." She gestured toward the twins, who were helping each other navigate a collaborative problem-solving exercise with the kind of focus that traditional education rarely inspired. "This is working because it comes from authentic care. But authentic care doesn't protect you from people who see disruption as a threat." Her warning carried weight that Daniel couldn't dismiss. Carmen was reminding him that good intentions weren't armor against systemic retaliation. That building something beautiful didn't guarantee protection from people who profited from existing ugliness. As they packed up that evening, Daniel made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He would continue developing the platform, but he would do it transparently. No secret corporate maneuvering, no leveraging of insider information, no attempts to win by the rules that had excluded him. If this was going to work, it would work on its own terms, serving the families who needed it most rather than the institutions that had failed them. The risk was enormous. The potential for corporate retaliation was real, but Miguel and Sofia were proof that some things were worth defending, even when, especially when, the defense meant choosing people over systems, authenticity over approval, footnotes over headlines. 3 weeks later, the informal program had grown to 12 families. Word of mouth had proven more effective than any marketing strategy Daniel had ever studied. Parents brought their children to the library not because of promotional campaigns, but because their neighbors' kids were actually excited about learning for the first time in months. Carmen had emerged as an unofficial coordinator, helping new families navigate the platform while continuing to refine the pedagogical approaches that made it work. Her confidence had grown with each successful interaction, but so had her vigilance about maintaining the program's grassroots character. "We're walking a fine line," she said during their evening debrief session. "The librarians are supportive, but they're also nervous about unofficial programs that could create liability issues." Daniel understood the concern. What had started as casual computer help was becoming an organized educational initiative without institutional oversight. They were operating in a gray area that depended on goodwill and could be shut down by a single complaint or administrative review. The complexity deepened when Elena Martinez approached Carmen after a community board meeting. Elena worked for the city's Department of Education, specifically in the division responsible for evaluating alternative learning programs. Her daughter had been struggling with traditional classroom environments, and she had heard about the library program through unofficial channels. "I'm here as a parent, not as a city employee," Elena clarified when Carmen introduced her to Daniel. "But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious about what you've built from a professional perspective." Elena's presence created immediate tension. Her 8-year-old daughter, Isabella, displayed the same learning patterns that made the platform effective: high intelligence combined with non-traditional cognitive processing. But Elena's professional role meant that any evaluation she conducted could either legitimize their work or expose it to regulatory scrutiny they weren't prepared to handle. Daniel watched Elena observe the program for several sessions, noting how she documented interactions without interfering, how she asked questions that revealed deep understanding of both educational theory and bureaucratic realities. She was clearly impressed by what she witnessed, but her expressions also carried the complexity of someone recognizing both potential and problems. "This is remarkable," Elena said, after watching Isabella collaborate with Miguel and Sofia on a project that seamlessly integrated mathematics, science, and creative problem-solving. "The engagement levels are unlike anything I've seen in formal classroom settings. But it's operating without the oversight structures that official educational programs require," Daniel finished. "Exactly. And that creates vulnerability for everyone involved. For the families participating, for the library hosting, and for you as the primary facilitator." Carmen's discomfort was visible. "Are you saying we need to shut down?" "I'm saying you need to decide what you want this to become," Eleanor replied carefully. "If it stays informal, it remains vulnerable to being shut down by any administrator who decides it's inappropriate. If it seeks official recognition, it has to comply with regulations that could fundamentally change its character." The dilemma was exactly what Daniel had feared. The program worked because it prioritized authentic learning over institutional requirements. But sustainability required some form of recognition from the very systems they were trying to circumvent. Daniel spent the following days researching models for community-based educational initiatives. Most had either remained small and precarious or had grown by accepting constraints that compromised their original vision. The few that had achieved both scale and authenticity had done so through partnerships that required tremendous political navigation. The decision point came when Carmen received a call from the library administration. Someone had filed a formal inquiry about the unauthorized educational programming taking place during evening hours. The caller had remained anonymous, but the description of their concerns suggested familiarity with both the program's structure and its potential regulatory violations. "They want to meet with us tomorrow," Carmen told Daniel after the call. "All three of us, you, me, and Eleanor, if she's willing to attend as an expert witness." Daniel felt the weight of institutional attention settling around their small experiment. Whether that attention came from genuine concern about educational compliance or from less transparent motivations, it represented the end of their period of protective obscurity. That night, Daniel called his mother from his apartment, needing her perspective on a decision that felt larger than his individual judgment could handle. "They want us to either become official or disappear," he explained. "What do the families want?" Maria asked. "They want their children to keep learning in ways that actually work for them. Then you already know what to choose. But if we go official, we might have to compromise the things that make it work." Someone had decided their work was significant enough to warrant official scrutiny, and if we don't, they might shut us down completely. His mother was quiet for a long moment. "Daniel, when I started cleaning that building, I could have stayed invisible forever, safe, ignored, but invisible. Instead, I chose to notice things, to understand how power worked, to see opportunities others missed. Sometimes protection comes from visibility, not from hiding." Her words carried the wisdom of someone who had spent 15 years observing institutional dynamics from positions of manufactured invisibility. Maria was suggesting that their best defense might be transparency rather than secrecy, engagement rather than evasion. "You think we should embrace the scrutiny?" "I think you should embrace being excellent at what you're doing." Excellence has a way of creating its own protection. As Daniel prepared for the next day's meeting, he realized his mother had given him more than advice. She had reminded him that footnotes became significant not by avoiding attention, but by containing information that became impossible to ignore. The meeting took place in the library's community conference room, a space that smelled of old coffee and municipal responsibility. 3 administrators sat across from Daniel, Carmen, and Elena, the head librarian, a representative from the Parks Department, and a woman from the Department of Education, whose title was so specific it seemed designed to discourage questions. Daniel had prepared documentation of everything they had built, learning outcome data, family satisfaction surveys, detailed pedagogical frameworks. But as the meeting progressed, he realized that evidence of effectiveness was not the primary concern. The issue isn't whether this program works, the DOE representative explained with practiced bureaucratic neutrality. The issue is liability coverage, regulatory compliance, and appropriate oversight structures. Unofficial educational programming creates exposure for the city. Carmen leaned forward, her voice carefully controlled. What if the families involved are willing to accept responsibility for participation? These children are learning more in 6 weeks than they learned in 6 months of traditional classroom instruction. We understand the enthusiasm, the head librarian replied. But institutional policies exist to protect everyone involved. If a child were injured during program activities, or if academic progress claims couldn't be verified through approved assessment methods, the legal implications would be significant. Daniel felt the conversation slipping toward predetermined conclusions. These administrators weren't evaluating the program's merits. They were managing risk according to protocols that had no category for what he and Carmen had created. Elena had remained quiet throughout the discussion, but now she spoke with the precision of someone who understood bureaucratic language. What if the program could demonstrate compliance with existing alternative education frameworks? The city has approved community-based learning initiatives before. That would require formal proposal submission, comprehensive review, and ongoing oversight that could take 6 to 8 months to implement, the DOE representative said, during which time all current activities would need to cease. The ultimatum was politely delivered, but absolutely clear. Stop now and maybe restart later under institutional supervision, or continue informally and risk immediate shutdown with potential legal complications for everyone involved. Carmen's expression shifted as the implications settled. 8 months of bureaucratic review meant 8 months of children returning to educational approaches that had already failed them. It meant Miguel and Sofia losing momentum just as they were discovering their own intellectual capabilities. 8 months, she repeated quietly. My children will be in 3rd grade by then. Different developmental stage, different learning needs, different classroom dynamics. This window won't exist anymore. Daniel watched Carmen process the impossible choice between immediate effectiveness and future sustainability. Her children's education was happening now, in real time, with results that were obvious to anyone who observed them directly. But institutional approval required documentation periods that moved according to administrative calendars rather than child development timelines. Is there any pathway for temporary continuation during the review process? Daniel asked, though he suspected the answer. City policy doesn't allow parallel programs during official evaluation periods, the park's representative explained. Too much potential for confusion about which activities fall under which oversight structure. Elena attempted one more intervention. What if we could establish a limited pilot program with enhanced documentation? Something that demonstrates compliance while maintaining program effectiveness. The 3 administrators exchanged glances that communicated volumes about internal policies Daniel couldn't access. We can discuss modified frameworks, the DOE representative said carefully, but any ongoing activity would require insurance coverage, certified supervision, and assessment protocols that align with state educational standards. Daniel understood. They could keep the program alive, but only by transforming it into something that looked like every other institutional educational initiative. The adaptive learning approaches that made it effective would have to be standardized. Carmen's insights about individual cognitive patterns would have to be documented through approved measurement tools. The twins' natural learning enthusiasm would have to be channeled through curriculum requirements designed for statistical rather than individual success. After the meeting, the three of them sat in Elena's car outside the library, processing what had just occurred. The choice was stark. Surrender the program's authenticity to gain institutional protection, or maintain its effectiveness while risking complete elimination. I can't ask these families to gamble their children's education on regulatory approval that might never come, Carmen said finally. But I also can't ask them to accept compromise that undoes everything we've accomplished. Daniel stared out the window at the library where it had all begun, where families came each evening with hope that their children's intelligence would be recognized and nurtured. Inside those walls, learning was happening according to human timelines rather than administrative ones. Children were discovering capabilities that standardized assessments would never capture. "What if we chose excellence over approval?" he said, echoing his mother's words. "What if we documented everything so thoroughly that shutdown becomes politically difficult rather than administratively convenient?" Elena looked at him with interest. "You're talking about making the program too valuable to eliminate. I'm talking about making the families too visible to ignore." Carmen was quiet for a long moment, weighing risks against possibilities. "That's not hiding anymore. That's direct confrontation with systems that have significant power to retaliate." "Yes," Daniel said. "But it's also direct alliance with families who have every right to demand education that serves their children." The decision hung between them like a bridge that could only be crossed together. On one side lay safety through institutional compliance. On the other lay authenticity through principled resistance. Carmen looked back toward the library, where through the windows they could see the evening cleanup crew beginning their work. "My children deserve better than compromise," she said quietly. "If we're going to fight, let's fight for something worth winning." The decision to embrace visibility rather than seek approval transformed everything overnight. Daniel, Carmen, and Elena spent the weekend developing a comprehensive documentation strategy that would make their program impossible to dismiss as an informal hobby. They would create evidence so compelling that institutional opposition would require public justification. Carmen took charge of family testimonials, conducting systematic interviews with parents about their children's learning transformations. Her background in documenting her own children's educational needs translated perfectly to creating detailed case studies that demonstrated measurable progress across multiple families. Elena provided regulatory expertise, identifying exactly which educational standards the program was exceeding and which bureaucratic concerns were actually addressing legitimate oversight versus protecting institutional territory. Her insider knowledge revealed that much of the administrative resistance came from departments protecting budget allocations rather than child welfare. Daniel focused on technical documentation, creating detailed analyses of how their adaptive learning algorithms outperformed traditional educational software. But more importantly, he began reaching out to educational researchers, child development specialists, and community advocacy organizations who might amplify their work. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dr. Sarah Chen, from Columbia's Teachers College, requested permission to observe their sessions as part of her research on personalized learning. Maria Gonzalez from the New York Immigration Coalition wanted to discuss replicating their model with recently arrived families. 3 different graduate students asked to write their dissertations on the program's community-based approach. Within 2 weeks, their small library experiment had gained attention from academic institutions, advocacy organizations, and media outlets focused on educational innovation. The visibility was exactly what Daniel had hoped for, but it also attracted attention he hadn't anticipated. On a Tuesday evening, as families were arriving for their regular session, Daniel noticed a man in an expensive suit observing from the library's periodical section. The stranger was photographing participants with his phone while pretending to read magazines. When Daniel approached, the man claimed to be researching community education trends for a consulting firm, but his questions revealed familiarity with Daniel's employment history and specific details about the platform's technical architecture. Carmen noticed Daniel's tension immediately. "What's wrong?" "I think my former employer knows what we're building." The implications were immediate. Corporate attention meant potential legal challenges, intellectual property claims, or harassment designed to discourage families from participating. Daniel had expected bureaucratic obstacles, but he hadn't prepared for the possibility that his rejected corporate proposal could be reframed as proprietary information used without permission. Elena suggested they consult with a lawyer who specialized in educational law and community organizing. The program's community-based nature provided some legal shelter, but Daniel's employment agreements contained broad, non-compete clauses that could be interpreted to restrict his current activities. "The question," the lawyer explained, "is whether your former employer wants to claim ownership of ideas they officially rejected, or whether they want to prevent you from demonstrating that their rejection was a mistake." Daniel understood the strategic dilemma from his former employer's perspective. The consultation revealed both protections and vulnerabilities. If his platform succeeded, it would validate everything they had dismissed and potentially expose their leadership to criticism about missing obvious opportunities. Their best option might be to prevent his success rather than compete with it. The pressure intensified when Carmen received a phone call at home from someone claiming to represent Child Protective Services, asking questions about the educational supervision her children were receiving at the library program. The caller's information didn't check out when Carmen attempted to verify it, but the message was clear. Participation in the program could be reframed as educational neglect if powerful interests chose to pursue that interpretation. "They're trying to scare us into quitting," Carmen said after reporting the incident, "using our children as pressure points." Daniel felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. His decision to pursue visibility had brought attention that was now threatening the families he had promised to protect. Carmen and Elena were facing professional and personal risks because they had chosen to support his vision, but the families refused to be intimidated. When Miguel and Sofia learned that some people wanted to shut down their program, their response was immediate and clear. "That's not fair," Sofia declared with 7-year-old indignation. "We're learning better here than anywhere else." Miguel nodded seriously. "If they don't like how we learn, they should build something better. But they can't just take away something that works." Their logic was flawless, and their determination was infectious. Other children in the program echoed similar sentiments when their parents explained the situation. Rather than being discouraged by external pressure, the families became more committed to defending what they had created together. Carmen organized the families into a mutual support network, establishing communication systems and emergency plans in case officials attempted to disrupt their sessions. Elena used her professional connections to ensure that any official inquiries would be properly documented and transparently handled. Daniel realized that his choice to embrace visibility had triggered exactly the confrontation he had tried to avoid. But instead of facing it alone, he was now part of a community that shared both the risks and the determination to protect what they had built. The platform wasn't just serving families anymore. it was transforming them into advocates for their own children's educational rights. Carmen had evolved from a cautious participant to a confident organizer. Eleanor had moved from professional observer to committed ally. The twins had become articulate defenders of their own learning needs. Standing in the library that Tuesday evening, watching families work together despite external pressure, Daniel understood that his irreversible decision had created something larger than an educational program. It had created a community willing to fight for the principle that children's learning mattered more than institutional convenience. The battle was no longer about his corporate rejection or personal vindication. It was about whether authentic educational innovation could survive systematic attempts to suppress it. The transformation accelerated beyond anything Daniel had imagined possible. Within 6 weeks of choosing visibility over approval, their small library program had become the center of a broader conversation about community-controlled education. Carmen emerged as a natural spokesperson, her authenticity and practical expertise making her incredibly effective in media interviews and community presentations. Dr. Sarah Chen's research documentation provided academic legitimacy that bureaucratic opponents found difficult to dismiss. Her preliminary findings showed learning acceleration rates that exceeded traditional classroom metrics by substantial margins. More importantly, her research revealed that children in the program demonstrated increased confidence, creativity, and collaborative problem-solving abilities that standardized assessments couldn't measure, but employers desperately needed. The program expanded to 3 additional library branches, with each location adapting the core model to serve their specific community demographics. Carmen coordinated between sites, training new parent facilitators and ensuring that the community-driven character remained intact despite growth. Elena helped navigate regulatory requirements at each location, building relationships with supportive administrators while documenting compliance with all legitimate oversight concerns. But success also intensified opposition. Daniel's former employer filed a formal complaint alleging intellectual property violation, claiming that his adaptive learning algorithms constituted proprietary technology developed during his employment. The legal challenge required expensive defense and created uncertainty that some families found too stressful to maintain. The pressure came from multiple directions. Anonymous complaints about child safety led to unannounced inspections that found no violations, but created anxiety among participants. Zoning challenges questioned whether library spaces could be used for organized educational activities. Budget reviews targeted library programs generally, with particular scrutiny for activities that weren't explicitly covered by municipal insurance policies. Daniel watched Carmen handle each crisis with steadiness that amazed him. When reporters asked about her qualifications to coordinate educational programming, she responded by detailing the 7 years of research she had conducted while advocating for her children. When bureaucrats questioned the program's legitimacy, she arranged for them to observe sessions and speak directly with families about results. "People keep asking if we're qualified to do this work," Carmen said during a strategy meeting. "But the question isn't whether we're qualified, it's whether the systems that rejected our children are qualified to serve them." Her confidence had transformed completely from the tentative woman Daniel had first met, struggling with a job application. Carmen now spoke at community board meetings, organized parent advocacy networks, and consulted with other communities interested in replicating their model. But her growth was grounded in practical service rather than abstract recognition. Miguel and Sofia had become confident ambassadors for their own education, capable of explaining to adults why adaptive learning worked better for them than traditional classroom structures. Their articulate advocacy influenced other children in the program, creating a generation of students who understood their own learning needs and could communicate them clearly. The program's influence extended beyond immediate participants. Teachers at local schools began asking questions about adaptive learning techniques. Other parent groups requested training in educational advocacy strategies. Community organizations wanted to understand how grassroots programs could create systemic change without depending on institutional approval. Elena used her position within the Department of Education to document these broader impacts, building a case that community-driven programs could complement rather than compete with traditional educational structures. Her internal reports demonstrated that families participating in the library program showed increased engagement with their children's formal schooling, rather than decreased respect for educational institutions. The legal challenge reached resolution when Daniel's employment agreements were reviewed by a judge who determined that ideas officially rejected by an employer couldn't simultaneously be claimed as proprietary property. The ruling established precedent that protected other educational innovators from similar corporate harassment. But the most significant transformation was personal. Daniel no longer defined himself in relation to the corporate hierarchy that had dismissed him. His identity was now rooted in service to families whose children's success validated his work daily. Carmen's research informed his technical development, while the twins' feedback guided his design decisions. His relationship with his mother deepened as well. Maria began attending community meetings, sharing insights from her 15 years of observing institutional dynamics from positions of manufactured invisibility. Her perspective on how power actually functioned helped the group anticipate opposition strategies and develop more effective responses. "You found your place," Maria told him, after watching him facilitate a meeting between families and educational researchers. "Not the place someone else assigned you, but the place you created by serving something larger than yourself." Standing in the library's main room, watching 23 families work together on projects that combined academic learning with community problem-solving, Daniel understood that transformation was never really individual. His corporate rejection had been necessary to force him toward collaboration with people whose wisdom he never would have encountered within institutional hierarchies. The program succeeded not because it replaced traditional education, but because it demonstrated what became possible when families were treated as partners rather than consumers in their children's learning. Carmen's insights, Elena's expertise, the twins' feedback, and dozens of other voices had created something none of them could have built alone. Daniel had learned that footnotes became significant not by demanding attention from those who dismissed them, but by creating value that made dismissal impossible. Excellence, as his mother had suggested, created its own protection, but only when excellence was defined by service to real human needs rather than institutional recognition. The program was now sustainable, replicable, and politically protected by the community it served. What had begun as personal rejection had become collective empowerment, proving that sometimes the most important victories happened in the margins where authentic innovation was still possible. 1 year after that first meeting in the Bronx Library, Daniel stood before a very different kind of conference room. The Coalition for Community Education had invited him to present their model at a national symposium. But this time, the audience consisted of families, teachers, and community organizers rather than corporate executives seeking profit margins. The presentation focused not on market penetration or scalability metrics, but on the stories of transformation that had emerged from their work. Carmen sat in the front row with Miguel and Sofia, who had requested permission to answer questions about their learning experiences. Elena was part of the panel, representing the perspective of education professionals who had learned to support, rather than supervise, community-driven innovation. "The most important thing we discovered," Daniel explained to the audience, was that effective education requires partnership between families and facilitators, not hierarchy between institutions and consumers. When parents become collaborators in their children's learning, rather than passive recipients of expert services, the results exceed anything traditional structures can achieve. During the question period, a mother from Detroit asked how other communities could replicate their approach without triggering the same institutional resistance they had faced. Carmen answered with the confidence of someone who had navigated every stage of that resistance successfully. "You start with one family, then two families, then three," she said. "You document everything carefully. You build relationships with supportive professionals who can provide expertise and regulatory guidance. But most importantly, you never compromise on the principle that parents know their children better than any standardized system can measure." Miguel raised his hand, which prompted gentle laughter from the audience. "Can I say something?" "Of course," Daniel nodded. "The grown-ups always want to make things complicated, but it's actually simple. Kids learn better when people listen to how their brains work instead of trying to make their brains work like everyone else's." "That's not hard to understand," Sophia added, "and when parents and teachers work together instead of arguing about who's in charge, everyone wins. We don't need to choose between home learning and school learning if the adults cooperate." Their clarity impressed the audience more than any academic research could have accomplished. These children had experienced both traditional and adaptive educational approaches, and they could articulate the differences with precision that came from direct personal knowledge rather than theoretical speculation. After the presentation, Daniel was approached by representatives from 12 different communities interested in developing similar programs, but he also received an unexpected visitor, Dr. James Morrison, the current Chief Education Officer for the company that had rejected his original proposal. "I wanted to speak with you privately," Dr. Morrison said, requesting a brief meeting outside the conference venue. Daniel agreed, curious about what his former employer's leadership wanted to discuss after a year of legal challenges and public competition. "We've been following your work," Dr. Morrison began. "The community response has been remarkable, and the learning outcomes speak for themselves. We're interested in discussing potential partnership opportunities." Daniel studied the man's expression, looking for signs of the dismissive attitude he had encountered in that mahogany conference room where his place had been assigned to the footnotes. Instead, he saw genuine interest mixed with what appeared to be institutional embarrassment. "What kind of partnership?" "Funding support for expansion, technical infrastructure assistance, professional development resources for community facilitators. We recognize that our traditional top-down approach has limitations, and we're interested in learning from models that prioritize community engagement." The offer was substantial and would provide resources that could accelerate their work significantly. But Daniel had learned to evaluate opportunities according to different criteria than he had used during his corporate years. "What would you expect in return?" "Brand association. Documentation of our support for innovative educational approaches. Opportunity to study your methods for potential integration with our existing platforms." Daniel understood. His former employer wanted to associate themselves with his success, while potentially incorporating his innovations into their profit-generating systems. They were offering to transform community-controlled education into corporately sponsored programming. "I need to discuss this with my partners," Daniel said. "But I should mention that any collaboration would require maintaining community control over curriculum, assessment and expansion decisions. Financial support would be welcome, but not at the expense of family autonomy." Dr. Morrison nodded carefully. "We understand that autonomy has been crucial to your effectiveness. We're interested in supporting rather than acquiring your approach." After Dr. Morrison left, Daniel rejoined Carmen, Eleanor, and the twins for dinner. He described the conversation, watching their faces as they processed the implications of corporate partnership. "It's a test," Carmen said thoughtfully. "They want to see if success will make us compromise the principles that created the success." Elena agreed. "Partnership with your former employer could provide resources for expansion, but it could also gradually shift decision-making power away from families and toward institutional priorities." Miguel looked concerned. "Would that mean going back to the old way of learning?" "Not necessarily," Daniel replied. "But it would mean being very careful about maintaining control over what we've built." Sophia had been quiet during the conversation, but now she spoke with the seriousness that had characterized her since their first meeting. "If they really want to help, they should fund other communities to build their own programs, not try to own ours." Her suggestion was remarkably sophisticated. Rather than accepting corporate partnership that could compromise their independence, they could advocate for corporate support of similar community-driven initiatives in other locations. This approach would spread their model while preserving the autonomy that made it effective. "That's exactly right," Carmen said with pride. "We don't need to choose between resources and independence if we're creative about how we define partnership." Sitting in that restaurant, watching the twins contribute to strategic discussions about educational policy and community organizing, Daniel understood how completely his definition of success had transformed. Victory was no longer about corporate validation or institutional recognition. It was about families like Carmen's gaining the confidence and resources to advocate for their children's authentic learning needs. The conversation with Dr. Morrison had clarified something important. They had moved beyond seeking permission from systems that had rejected them. No, those systems were seeking permission to associate with what they had built independently. 18 months after that first computer lesson in the Bronx Public Library, Daniel found himself part of a family that had never existed in any blueprint, but had become more real than any relationship he had experienced before. Sunday dinners at Carmen's apartment had become a weekly tradition, bringing together not just their core collaboration, but an extended network of families whose lives had intersected through their shared commitment to community-controlled education. Miguel and Sophia moved through the crowded apartment with the confidence of children who understood their own significance. They helped Elena's daughter Isabella with a mathematics project that seamlessly integrated art and engineering principles. They showed newcomers how to navigate the learning platform with patience that demonstrated their own teaching abilities. Most importantly, they participated in conversations about program development as full partners rather than beneficiaries. "We've been invited to present at the International Conference on Educational Innovation," Carmen announced as families gathered around her kitchen table. "But they want to focus on our model as an example of successful parent engagement rather than community-controlled learning." Daniel understood the distinction immediately. Parent engagement implied that families participated in educational decisions made by professional institutions. Community-controlled learning meant that families maintained authority over their children's educational experiences while collaborating with supportive professionals. "Same problem we've faced from the beginning," Elena observed. "People want to celebrate what we've accomplished while reframing it to fit existing categories." "So we don't let them reframe it," Sophia said with 8-year-old directness. "We tell our own story." Miguel nodded seriously. "And we make sure other kids get to tell their stories too." Their suggestion led to a decision that surprised even Daniel with its ambition. Rather than simply presenting at the conference, they would organize a parallel symposium focused specifically on family-controlled educational innovation. They would invite other communities that had developed similar approaches, creating a network that could support replication without corporate or institutional mediation. The planning process revealed how much their original group had developed both individually and collectively. Carmen coordinated logistics with the efficiency of someone who had learned to manage complex projects under pressure. Elena handled regulatory and legal frameworks with expertise that extended far beyond her original role as concerned parent. Daniel focused on technical documentation and platform development, but his work was now guided by insights from dozens of families rather than corporate market research. The symposium attracted 47 communities from across the United States and 12 international participants. Representatives included parent-led homeschooling cooperatives, immigrant community education networks, rural library partnerships, and urban neighborhood learning centers. What they shared was not methodology, but principle, the conviction that families should control their children's educational experiences while accessing resources and expertise that supported rather than superseded their authority. Daniel's presentation focused on technical infrastructure, demonstrating how adaptive learning platforms could be developed and maintained by communities rather than corporations. But the most powerful moments came when families described their own transformation processes, sharing strategies that had worked and obstacles they had overcome. A mother from rural Montana explained how their community had partnered with local ranchers to create experiential learning programs that combined traditional academic subjects with practical skills. Children learned mathematics through livestock management, developed writing abilities through agricultural journalism, and studied science through environmental stewardship projects that served their actual community. A father from East Los Angeles described how their neighborhood had transformed an abandoned lot into an outdoor classroom where bilingual education happened through gardening, construction projects, and small business development. Their approach honored both languages and cultures while preparing children for college and career opportunities. Carmen presented their own journey, emphasizing how program development had strengthened rather than replaced her children's relationship with formal schooling. Miguel and Sofia now approached their traditional classroom experiences with confidence and advocacy skills that benefited not just themselves, but their classmates who struggled with standardized approaches. The goal was never to reject institutional education, Carmen explained to the symposium audience. The goal was to ensure that our children could engage with institutions as empowered participants rather than passive recipients. During the question period, Miguel and Sofia joined the presentation panel, fielding inquiries about their learning experiences with articulate sophistication that impressed the audience of educational professionals and community organizers. What would you tell other kids whose parents are thinking about starting programs like this? A conference participant asked. Sophia considered the question seriously. I'd tell them it's not about choosing between different kinds of school. It's about making sure that learning happens in ways that help you become who you actually are, not who some test says you should be. Miguel added, and I'd tell them that their parents are smarter about their education than anyone else, even if other people don't always recognize that. Watching them field complex questions with confidence and clarity, Daniel understood that their program had achieved something beyond educational innovation. It had created conditions where children could develop intellectual autonomy while maintaining strong family relationships, where learning enhanced rather than competed with community belonging. The symposium concluded with commitments from 32 communities to maintain ongoing collaboration, sharing resources and strategies while preserving the local control that made their approaches effective. They established communication networks, resource-sharing protocols, and mutual support systems that would operate independently of any institutional oversight. Standing in the hotel conference room, where families from diverse communities had gathered to celebrate and strategize, Daniel felt the satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. Not the hollow satisfaction of corporate achievement, but the deep contentment that came from serving something larger than individual ambition. Carmen approached him as families were preparing to depart. "You know what's remarkable about all this?" "What?" "None of us had to become different people. We just had to become more of who we actually were." Daniel looked around the room, watching families say goodbye with the warmth of people who had found their community and understood exactly what she meant. Their success had come not from conforming to external expectations, but from honoring authentic relationships and serving real human needs. 2 years after Marcus Donovan had assigned him to the footnotes, Daniel stood in the same Manhattan building where his corporate career had ended, but this time he walked through the lobby as a visitor, not an employee. He was meeting with the building's facilities manager about a proposal that would have seemed impossible during his years of invisible servitude. The Community Education Foundation, the non-profit organization that had emerged from their library program, had been invited to establish a demonstration site in one of the building's unused conference rooms. Corporate tenants wanted their employees to understand how family-controlled learning could complement traditional educational approaches for their own children. His mother met him in the lobby, her cleaning cart replaced by a visitor's badge and a folder containing documentation of the Foundation's educational consulting services. Maria had transitioned from night-shift custodial work to day-shift community engagement, helping other working parents understand how to advocate for their children's authentic learning needs. "Ready for this?" she asked as they rode the elevator to the 44th floor. "More than ready." The conference room where his presentation had been dismissed now hosted a different kind of meeting. Carmen facilitated a discussion between corporate executives and their spouses about educational options for children who didn't thrive in traditional school environments. Miguel and Sofia, now 9 years old, demonstrated platform features while answering questions about their own learning experiences. Elena provided regulatory context, explaining how community-controlled education could operate within existing legal frameworks while offering families significantly more autonomy than traditional institutional structures. Her expertise had evolved from bureaucratic compliance to community empowerment, translating complex policies into accessible information that helped families make informed decisions. Daniel's role in these consultations was primarily technical, explaining how adaptive learning platforms could be developed and maintained by parent networks rather than corporate vendors. But his real satisfaction came from observing the transformation that occurred when families understood they could control their children's educational experiences rather than simply choosing between predetermined options. "The most important thing we learned," Carmen explained to the group of concerned parents, "was that excellence in education comes from matching learning approaches to individual children's needs, not from forcing children to adapt to institutional requirements." Father raised his hand. "But how do you ensure academic rigor without standardized benchmarks?" Sophia answered, before any of the adults could respond. "Rigor means working hard on things that matter to you and help you grow. That's different for different kids, but it doesn't mean easier." Miguel nodded. "When learning matches how your brain actually works, you can do much harder things than when you're fighting the system the whole time." Their confident articulation of complex educational concepts never ceased to amaze the professionals who observed their development. These children could discuss learning theory, advocate for their educational needs, and collaborate with adults as equals, capabilities that emerged directly from being treated as partners rather than recipients in their own education. After the consultation session, Daniel and his mother walked through the building's executive floors. The mahogany conference room, where his original presentation had been rejected, now hosted strategy meetings about community engagement initiatives and family-centered programming approaches. His ideas had become corporate talking points, though the authentic implementation remained in community hands. They stopped at the window overlooking Central Park, where late afternoon light painted the city in shades of possibility and remembrance. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they had accepted your first presentation? Maria asked. Daniel considered the question carefully. I think it would have become just another corporate educational product, profitable, maybe even effective, but controlled by people who had never experienced the learning challenges it was designed to solve. And now it belongs to the families who built it. They control how it develops, how it's used, who benefits from it. That's the difference between charity and justice. His phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. New family at the library wants to get started. Can you come tomorrow evening? Daniel smiled, typing back, absolutely. What do we know about their children's learning needs? Walking toward the elevator, he passed his old desk in the operations corner. Someone new sat there now, probably facing similar challenges about recognition and professional advancement. Daniel left his foundation's business card with the security guard, along with a note, for anyone interested in educational innovation that serves families rather than institutions. Outside the building, Manhattan moved with its eternal rhythm of ambition and achievement. But Daniel no longer measured himself against that pace or those definitions of success. His purpose was rooted in Tuesday evening library sessions, where families worked together, in children who understood their own intelligence, in parents who had discovered their capacity for educational leadership. The foundation was sustainable now, funded through consulting fees from organizations that wanted to learn from their community-controlled approach. Their model had been replicated in 43 communities across 16 states. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that authentic educational innovation was possible when families maintained control over their own children's learning experiences. Daniel's place was no longer in the footnotes of someone else's document. He had learned to write his own story in collaboration with people whose wisdom had never been acknowledged by the systems that claimed expertise over their lives. The footnote had become the foundation for something entirely different, not seeking approval from institutions that had rejected him, but building alternatives that served the people those institutions consistently failed. Carmen was right. They had not become different people. They had simply become more of who they actually were, in service of children whose intelligence deserved recognition, families whose insights deserved respect, and communities whose autonomy deserved protection. Walking through the city where his transformation had begun, Daniel understood that the most important victories were often invisible to the systems that measured conventional success. But they were visible to the children, whose education honored their authentic capabilities, to the parents whose expertise was finally acknowledged, and to the communities that had learned they could create the changes they needed, rather than waiting for permission from institutions that might never grant it.